All right, so another possibility, let's just reset this again, is to do it visually on the image itself. So if you look on the side here, you'll see there are 3 eyedroppers, black, gray, and white. And what this allows you to do, and this is a little less technical than looking at the histogram or using that Option or Alt key, but some people like it because they just want to make a decision to say, I think right there should be the darkest spot. And I think right there should be the whitest spot. Okay? So, needless to say, if I took the black eyedropper, I should be clicking on what I think is the darkest area. And I'll show you a way in a minute that we can take some of that decision making out of your hands. But the danger, of course, is if you miss a little bit and say, I think this is the darkest part of the image, it's going to completely change things because you've just said, well, if that's the darkest spot, I've got to reorient everything else, and now it looks completely different. So if you're going for the nuclear holocaust look, you can easily do that by just clicking in the wrong place with the eyedropper. So generally, we're going to say, well, I think that should be the darkest spot right there. And I think up here somewhere it looks like one of the whitest parts. So that was me just taking a sort of a semi-educated guess by looking at it. So I'm not necessarily advocating that's an everyday use. Having said that, if you're in a situation where you're in full control, you're the photographer and you're doing a photo shoot with a place, a person, or something else, there are little cards you can get that have all sorts of color swatches on them, including black, gray, and white. And in the first shot, you get the person to hold it and then take it away. So then in Photoshop, the first time, so I know that's black, I know that's white, I know that's gray, and then save that as a preset that you can then apply to every other photograph. That's a really good idea unless you're a wildlife photographer, because you do not want to run up to the bear and say, let me just lean this card against you while I go and take a shot. I mean, I would not recommend that. Someone asked me once, couldn't you just add the gray card in after the fact? And that wouldn't work because it has to be how that photo is exposed. That's why it has to be in the shot. So you see a lot of people use various cards, either just a solid gray or one that has all different colors, but make sure it has black, white, gray on it. So that is a solution for that issue. Now, what you can do is make your life a little easier if you're not sure where I think I want to use eyedroppers, but I'm not sure where to click. This eyedropper over here, the standard eyedropper is the one we use to choose color from our image, but hidden under there is another one called the color sampler tool that looks just like an eyedropper, but has a little tiny symbol beside it. And what this allows me to do is mark spots on my image that I can come back and look at later on, so I can find them. So if I looked at this photograph and I had no clue where I should click with my black and where I should click with my white, one of the solutions that I could potentially do is to add a different type of adjustment layer temporarily. And again, the key reasons we're using adjustment layers is by nature they are temporary. So there is an adjustment layer called threshold, which I can't think of too many other reasons why you'd ever use this. Because a threshold adjustment layer says take away all color and all shades of gray and make a pixel either black or white. So in a photograph like this, you'd be like, yeah, that's awesome. I would like all my landscapes to look just like that. So you wouldn't use it for purposes, but what you can do is if you move it all the way to the left, this is the equivalent of me holding down that Option or Alt key, because now as I start to drag in, the first areas that appear are currently the darkest areas of my image. So with that active, if I take that color sampler tool and I click right on one of those black areas, now there's a little symbol with a number 1 beside it, and I know, and I always do it in the same order so I don't forget, black is first, white is second. You can do it whatever order you want as long as you remember. Then you take this to the other end, and as you start to drag in, it's going to show you and say, well, those are the whitest areas. Now, as you drag it in, you'll see little tiny specks appear. I would go just a little further so you see just a big enough part that you can actually click on it with the eyedropper. Because if it's too small, if you're off by a pixel, it's going to throw everything off. And if you wanted to, you could zoom in and get a little closer, of course. Some people that I work with, they want to give themselves choices. So they do 1 and 2 are both 2 different black points possibly, and 3 and 4, because you can have 4 in total. 3 and 4 are 2 different highlight spots. So that's another option if you wanted to. I tend to just use 2 because usually it's enough for what I want. So now you can see, I think it's easier to see the number 2 up there. Now if I were to add levels, I can, instead of guessing, take my black eyedropper and line it up on top of that one and take my white eyedropper and line it up on top of that one. So now the adjustment was made, still using those eyedroppers, but instead of me totally going, I think there's a good spot, this was a more educated guess. Okay? Those eyedroppers, by the way, also appear in curves. So you could also do exactly the same operation opening curves, but frankly, if you're going to use curves, there's other reasons you would use it besides just using the eyedroppers. Okay? The last thing I want to mention for now about curves is there's one other choice that some people like. And again, to me, I use this depending a lot on the image. By default, when you open curves and you look at that histogram and you use that as your reference to move those little triangles in, it's showing you the full RGB combination. But depending on the photograph, you can also use this method where you go to each individual channel. So I go to the red channel and it shows me the histogram for that one. So now I could move in these spots to kind of match up with the end of that histogram. Notice how the red channel didn't go all the way to the highlights like it did in the RGB. So that's telling me that there really isn't a lot of red in the highlights, which is either good or bad depending on how you look at it and how you want your image to look at. The one thing I will pause and tell you is don't judge this method until you get all the way through it, because about halfway through you'll be like, really? Because you're only adjusting individual color channels, so halfway through it looks quite often like, oh, this is not good. So you have to go through the whole thing before you decide, is this good or not? So you use that same theory for each one. And then blue. There are keyboard shortcuts for all of these things. So now you can see that's the adjustment that made. Some people use this method every single time they make an adjustment in levels because they feel like it's giving a little more accuracy. I've done a little bit of testing where I've kind of done a couple of different methods, and the difference is subtle enough that to me, I don't know that, I mean, that's one you'll just have to decide for yourself, I guess, and try it and see if there's one that you like better than the other.
Is there any way to automate that process, to do it on every single picture that you bring in?
Unfortunately not, because eventually you still have to move in the image yourself. What you could do is, like I said, there are keyboard shortcuts for red, green, and blue, so you can at least do that part a little faster. But yeah, unfortunately, that's one that's always nice to automate, but any automation includes moving not X%, but to match up with the histogram just makes it a little harder. Unless you had, I should clarify, I mean, if you had 25 photos that were taken exactly the same time, there's a better chance that you could at least automate because you're doing it to the same type of photo in each case.
Right.
But even that, I know personally, if I'm out there taking landscapes, I'm going to take a couple shots and then make a little tweak to settings so they're not all going to look exactly the same anyway. Okay?